The readings here are given in order, but you will notice that it's a sort of chicken syllabus in the sense that I don't say when I'm going to get to them, and the reason for that is that I don't know. Not because, I mean, I could make up dates and say I'm going to do this, but until I know you better, I really can't know precisely how long we will need to spend on some of these things. And I will try to give reasonable time to things so that, strange as it may seem, I would like very much to for you to actually understand what we're reading, and that may take a little bit longer in some cases, a little bit less time in other cases. So I'd like to keep a little bit of flexibility there, so at least in the summer, that's what I've done. But this will be the order in which we will look at things. You will notice that we begin with English Romantic Verse, that is this small volume here. And I asked you, as I did for last night, to look at several of those writers who once upon a time would have been called pre-Romantic writers. There are other terms for them, and I'll discuss those. But some of those who in the later part of the 18th century sort of led the way in certain ways, or anticipated in certain ways, the sort of full-fledged Romanticism that would begin developing with William Blake and Wordsworth. We continue with English Romantic Verse, which I abbreviate to ERV, in the second B reading, the next group of readings, and those will focus on William Blake. I would love to have more time to deal with Blake. He's a very important figure, but I will only deal with him in a somewhat selective way, but we will spend a bit of time on him. Then we come to Wordsworth, and this is the volume, Wordsworth's Selected Verse, that we will turn to, and there the readings will be pretty substantial, and the time we spend will also be fairly substantial. You'll remember my little sort of plan last time, which was to cover all of the major Romantic poets, but to cover one of them in considerable detail across a wide range of work, and Wordsworth was sort of my candidate for that, and so when we get there, we will sort of tuck in for a good long stay, because he is really of very, very great importance. Then we return to the English Romantic Verse volume and a look at Wordsworth's collaborator and friend, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, with the major exhibit there being, as you could almost expect, Rhyme the Ancient Mariner, but we look at some other works as well. Then we return to or rather not return, but go on to the one complete work that we will read, which is Byron's gigantic romantic satire. That's, it's hard to come up with a precise term for Don Juan. It really is. That's one of the things that's most romantic about it. It's sort of everything. But romantic satire, at least as a shorthand term for it, will perhaps do. And we will be here for a considerable time. Then we end with two major, not end quite, but come to the end of the major phase of Romanticism with two important poets, both of whom died much too young, and that is the selections in English Romantic Verse from Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and John Keats. The last section, the literally last section, deals with what might be considered the sort of dying fall of Romanticism. Just as Romanticism was not born overnight, it did not decline overnight. It did not, that is, when Keats and Shelley died in 1821 and 1822, Romanticism did not stop at that point. There was actually a very gifted group of writers, and I've given some of them here, not all of them, but a substantial selection of them, who really carried on the Romantic tradition, but with declining force, I think it's fair to say. Something new was clearly in the wind, something that by the 1830s was going to produce a new phase of literature in the 19th century that would, as I said last time, not leave Romanticism totally behind by any means, but would really develop into something recognizably different from Romanticism. And that was, of course, the Victorian movement of the last two-thirds of the 19th century. What marks these writers as interesting is that they worked very hard to remain committed to a kind of pure romantic program at a time when most of literary culture was going in other directions. And perhaps because of that, because of sort of sticking romanticism in the world was becoming increasingly something else, their production is very interesting, but it is also limited. And it's very interesting, at least to me, and I hope it will be to you, to sort of realize the human aspect of the sort of arc of Romanticism. And that is, when you look, I think Romanticism, in its essential nature, is a high-risk way of living and writing. It just is. It takes chances. It lives with its heart to some degree on its sleeve. You know, I've sometimes thought that Romanticism is inherently manic depressive. That is to say, Romanticism is always dealing with highs and lows. You know, the classical periods of culture, and especially neoclassicism, which came right before Romanticism, tends to deal very little with the ecstatic heights of possibility and very little with the, you know, what can I say, the tragic depths of human possibility, and to try to center itself in what might be called the moderate and humane middle. And it stays there as much as it possibly can. So that even when it deals with tragic things, it deals with them from a sort of comic point of view. And if you don't know what I mean by that, just consider something like Swift's A Modest Proposal, which comes from the height of the classical period. And what is he dealing with? Poverty and misery and starvation. And how does he deal with it in a satiric, ironic, and comic, although darkly comic spirit? Same thing can be applied, of course, to Gulliver's Travels generally, which has to do with all kinds of really terrible things. But I defy anybody to read it without laughing, more or less, from beginning to end. And that's pretty typical of the neoclassical age. You know, even if we deal with harsh things, deal with them in a spirit of rational self-control. And that is typical of neoclassicism. Romanticism feels things deeply, whether it is the great heights or the great depths. One writer who is a kind of transition figure, who has sort of one foot in the neoclassical age and one foot in the romantic age. We will not be reading him, but he's an interesting figure. His name is Horace Walpole. He's the son of an English prime minister, great letter writer, and in fact the father of the Gothic novel. That's how he has a foot sort of in the development of Romanticism. You know, the Gothic novel, all those novels that deal with ghosts and goblins and movies, things that go bump in the night and all of that. You may think, you know, things like Dracula and Frankenstein and even to a degree Wuthering Heights is a kind of Gothic novel. You might think that that's a fairly modern, or at any rate, romantic development. It really wasn't. It was an 18th century development. And Horace Walpole, in his novel called The Castle of Otranto, which came out in the 1760s, is the beginning of the Gothic novel. But he said something that I've always thought very profound about the difference between neoclassicism and Romanticism. He said, life is a tragedy for those who feel and a comedy for those who think. Think about it. Life is a tragedy for those who feel and a comedy for those who think. I think it's fair to say in broad terms that the neoclassical age was for the most part a thinking age and therefore a comic age. Its typical ways of writing are satiric, ironic, comic. Give an example if I can that I hope will mean something to at least a couple of you. A great art historian, Sir Kenneth Clark, did a book many years ago, 30 years ago now, called Civilization, which sort of traces Western civilization through art, through the visual art. And when he gets to the 18th century, to the neoclassical age, he entitles his chapter on the neoclassical age, The Smile of Reason. The Smile of Reason. And what he gives is, on the page right next to that chapter heading, he has a Houdon was a sculptor, an Houdon bust of Voltaire, the great French neoclassical writer. And there's old Voltaire, you know, straight no doubt from writing Candide, that very laughing satire on all the terrible things of life, you know. You think you're bad because you've lost one part of your ass? Let me show you. I've lost both parts of my ass. But really is a scene in Candide, as you may know, truly. There again, the laughing sort of quality of the neoclassical age. But Kenneth Clark shows a sculpture of Voltaire, and old Voltaire is an old man in this sculpture. He doesn't have any teeth much left at all, but he's turning around, he's writing, and he's turning around, and this sort of old man's grin, as if to say, I've seen all there is of life, and I'm amused by it. No matter how bad it is, it amuses me. That is not the romantic spirit, is it? That is not. The romantic spirit is heartfelt. It is throbbing with passion. It feels life's ecstasies and life's tragedies with equal intensity and passion. That's what romanticism is all about. It is, as I say, sort of inherently manic-depressive, as we would say. It knows great heights and great depths, and we will find that all the way through. Now, you can almost tell from the way I'm discussing romanticism that to some degree, romanticism can be seen as a kind of reaction against neoclassicism. Now, I don't mean that in a mechanical way, you know, like you have neoclassicism, and then there had to be something to react to that, bing bong, you know, like sort of to every action, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. That's not what I'm getting at. But I think if you look at the history of culture, or the history of literature, or the history of the arts, or the history of anything, what you will see is that in one period, certain things, certain values, certain ways of looking at the world are seen to be natural, inevitable, they make sense. In the Middle Ages, it made sense to view everything from the point of view of eternity, the point of view of faith, the point of view of God, the point of view of sort of theological philosophy, which they call ecclesiastical philosophy or scholastic philosophy. That seemed as natural to them as computers, highways, and electric toothbrushes seem to us, I promise. Every age has things that seem inevitable, natural. That's the way it is. But the only trouble is, the way it is, what's natural, what's inevitable, is constantly changing. In the Middle Ages, it was one thing, an age of faith, an age of trust. It seemed just as natural to them to build thousands of Gothic cathedrals that took 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and sometimes 1,000 years to build, that were all for the glory of God, as it does to us to build the Sears Towers and the Empire State Building, which are surely cathedrals in praise of money. One seemed natural in the Middle Ages, the other seems natural to us, perhaps. They are obviously based on a totally different view of the world. Now, after the Middle Ages, what followed was a kind of reaction in which a world that was defined purely in spiritual, theological, divine, Christian terms no longer seemed big enough. There needed to be more, something a little bit more basically human, something that dealt with the ordinary passions and the ordinary experiences of life in a more colorful and intense and human and concrete way, and there needed to be more knowledge about that and examples of how to do that, how to think about political reality, how to think about emotional reality, how to think about personal reality, and all the rest of it. And so what you get, of course, is that great period of culture that we call the Renaissance, in which the rediscovery of the classical past is carried on, that is, of classical Greece and Rome, not because they were interested in just going back and raking up old stuff, but because they were looking for models of how to live life fully on a human and secular basis. Now, that does not mean that Christianity disappeared in the Renaissance. It most certainly did not. But it was blended with another great force that you can call Renaissance humanism, if you want to, that involved a new definition of reality that was combined, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes not so harmoniously, with the Christianity of the Middle Ages to produce a new culture. All you have to do is look at Dante from the Middle Ages with his vision of life that is all in terms of infinitude, eternity. For Dante, where is reality? It's inferno, purgatorio, paradiso, right? That's where that is. It's hell, purgatory, and heaven. That's where reality is to be found. That's typical of the Middle Ages. When Shakespeare comes along, who is perhaps the greatest poet of the Renaissance in Europe, where does he see reality as being? Look around. See human beings from top to bottom and east to west. see them in all of their complex human reality. We do not have a single Shakespearean play that takes place in hell, or in heaven, or purgatorio. His vision is not up and down, it's across. It's latitudinal. It's looking at human reality in an ordinary sort of human way. That's typical of the Renaissance. You think of any other Renaissance writer who looks at the world pretty much that way? They all do, pretty much. Although there is one great exception. How about, to move across the water a little bit from England, how about another great Renaissance writer, the Spaniard, Cervantes? He's very much looking at the world as it sadly is, isn't it? I mean, and in fact, couldn't you almost say that the whole problem with Don Quixote is that he, God bless his heart, can't bear to accept the mundane reality of the world. So for him, windmills become giants, Dulcinea becomes this magnificent, and all the rest of the kind of mind games he plays on himself so that he can live in a world of romance. But of course, to remind us that we're really in a world of very human reality, we have Sancho Panza, right, beside who's constantly saying, yes, master, but, and telling him, of course, about the harsh and comic realities of everyday life. The Renaissance was, in every possible sense of the word, whether you're looking at literature or you look at just general culture during that time, there's a period that was expanding, moving, changing. It was incredibly dynamic. And sometimes, you know, there's that joke, isn't there? The supposedly Chinese curse, mind you. May you live in interesting times. It's supposed to be a curse. Can you see why living in interesting times might be a curse? I don't know about you, but I'd like to live sometimes in boring times. Why would that be? In boring times, you have what? No great cataclysms, no great conflicts, no great wars, no great, earth-shattering changes in things. There's something to be said for that, believe me. But the Chinese curse, if indeed it is a Chinese curse, it's said to be, may you live in interesting times, could easily have been written about the Renaissance. I suspect it was the most intensely interesting period you could almost, in the whole history of Western civilization, have found. But it was also a period in which the problems of exploring a new world, the problems of intense warfare in every imaginable direction, things like the Spanish Armada, all kinds of things going on. After all, the final, one of the things that happens in the Renaissance toward the end are things like tremendous numbers of people being burned at the stake, the Spanish Inquisition, you see, the burning of witches in this country was basically a sort of tail end part of the Renaissance. People felt intensely about everything, and they fought out those intense disagreements in very bloody sorts of ways. It was energetic, it was creative, it was a profoundly interesting period, but it was also a period in which conflict, violence, and problems were very much rife. All you have to think of is some of the monarchs of the time in England, right? The two most important Renaissance monarchs in England were Henry VIII, and actually, if you really look at Henry VIII as a historical figure, he's very interesting historical figure. There is much about him that is intelligent, there's much that is highly cultivated. He was very much interested in what he saw as England's best good, what was good for England. But in order to bring about those supposedly good values, he had to do a lot of pretty nasty stuff. Sometimes perhaps a lot more nasty than he needed to have done, although he would have argued on the other side. If you're thinking about, as I dare say you might, Henry VIII's many wives and the somewhat tragic history of those wives, you have but one example. That is only one example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. And even someone later, and I think greater monarch, Elizabeth I, what does she have to do? She ends up in her life having to, at various times, put probably the two men that she cared the most about to death because they were politically inconvenient to her. And finally, a close kinswoman whom she did not want to have put to death, but finally felt that she had to. Who would that be? Who did Elizabeth I finally have put to death? She was Scottish. Mary, Queen of Scots. Yes, you get the idea. well, she wasn't mean exactly, but the political realities were so stressful and difficult and unsettled at the time that it was necessary. Many of the writers of the time emphasized this. They emphasized the fact that if you think about the tragedies written during the Renaissance, things like King Lear and Macbeth, and bloody tragedies like the White Devil, if you read that, or the Duchess of Malfi, or the Revenger's Tragedy, or any of those, they are full of revenge and blood and strange forms of death. And all you have to think of is Hamlet contemplating the skull, that he finds when he's out in the grave-digging scene. And it turns out, of course, alas, poor Yorick, I knew him well, a fellow of infinite jest, right, and all the rest. This is what it all comes to. And what does he finally say? Go to my lady's bedchamber, tell her, let her paint an inch thick, yet to this favor will she come. And that idea of the sort of skull beneath the skin, the sort of horror of death lurking around every corner, was the sort of dark underside of the sort of glorious Renaissance that was there. That's reflected throughout the culture of that time. It was a stressful as well as a highly creative time. The neoclassical age came after that, here in Anderson's 15-minute survey of Western civilization. But the neoclassical age comes afterwards, and I think we sometimes misunderstand the neoclassical age. It did not get all dry and wrinkled and croony based on a kind of hyper-developed rationality. In other words, it did not turn into a bunch of rational philosophers who thought reason could solve every problem whatsoever. That's a stereotype. That's not what happened. But what it did try to do was to restore human culture and restore human art to a somewhat more common sense and reasonable, middle-of-the-road, balanced sort of reality. It felt that it could understand things to a serious degree through the exercise of the analytic reason. Whereas in the Renaissance it had been much more a matter of sort of will and determination and Machiavellian cleverness and all the rest. But in the Renaissance, in the neoclassical age, and when does that begin? In England, about 1660, the neoclassical age began. It happens in part because Charles II, who was the victim of one of the surges of Renaissance energy, which we call the English Civil War. And of course, he wasn't the big victim, Charles II. His predecessor, Charles I, was the big victim. In fact, what happened to Charles I? Yes, he lost his head, you might say, over the Renaissance. He was beheaded. His kinsman, and should have been successor Charles II, had to go away to France. While he was there on what he always wittily called his travels. He was not traveling. What was he? He was in exile, wasn't he? He was hiding from his enemies back in England under Oliver Cromwell and so forth. But eventually Oliver Cromwell died. And the problem then becomes, gosh, how do we order society? The fellow who was sort of the guru of the Commonwealth, of the Puritan Revolution, is dead. What do we do? And it sort of shows that they didn't quite know what to do, that they tried to make the son of Oliver Cromwell the sort of next, it's like, okay, we don't have a king anymore, but now that we've got to come up with a way of ruling England, I guess we'll use the son of the leader we have, like, as if he were a king, you see. But it turned out that Richard Cromwell was a miserable disaster, the son of Oliver. And so it was time for a change. And most of the people in England at that point, at least people who had power and influence, felt it is what we want England back. We want the realm of England, that is the kingdom of England back. And so the question became, can we bring back Charles II? Will he return as king? And he, of course, said yes. And he did come back in 1660. That's called the restoration of the English monarchy. And with it comes not only the restoration of the English monarchy, but really the development of neoclassical literature in England. And why would that happen? Because when Charles II was over in France, he was at the court of Louis XIV. And Louis XIV, the Sun King, was not only the great monarch of Europe, he really was. He presided over the most powerful nation in Europe, but it wasn't just powerful in military or economic terms. It was also cultural, by far the most powerful nation in Europe. It was producing writers like Molière and Racine and Corneille and La Fontaine and La Bruyère. And these names, some of them will maybe mean something to you, some may not. But trust me, they're important writers in their own way in France. They called the kind of style they were developing in the middle of the 17th century French classicism. And of course, this became neoclassicism in England when it was sort of transferred or came over from France onto English soil. This is not a class in neoclassicism, obviously, but rather its successor, Romanticism. So I'm going to have to do a very, very superficial job of sort of suggesting what neoclassicism is all about. But the writers that England produced, neoclassical writers, are people like Dryden, people like Pope, people like Henry Fielding, people like Samuel Johnson, people like James Boswell, people like Lawrence Sterne, people like the great historian Gibbon, some of the lesser writers like John Gay, Matthew Prior, there are a lot of them. And it is a very rich period, a very important period, and it lasts for a long time. Its essential domination of English literature lasts from about 1660 to, roughly speaking, 1800. And it is in this context, this neoclassical context, that the first elements of Romanticism began to develop. Partly, no doubt, as a kind of reaction against neoclassicism. Because neoclassicism was powerful, it was useful, it was highly creative, it produced a tremendous body of art and thought and architecture and music and literature that was of tremendous value. But like every other age that has ever come along, it inevitably sort of valorized or placed great stress on certain things and a whole lot less stress on other things. Now, what did it value? It valued, on the whole, common sense and reason over, well, imagination and feeling. That's an oversimplification, but basically speaking, it is true. It valued clarity and structure in almost everything it did, whether it was architecture, thought, or literature, over spontaneity and sort of coloring of that, or what I say, highly individual modes of expression. It valued city life over country life. If you've ever read Molière's great play, Tartuffe, you may remember that there is precisely one reference to the countryside in all of Tartuffe. And that is when Orgon, the father of the household, returns from the country, and his brother-in-law, Cléante, greets him at the door and says, basically, I'm translating here, but he says, "How was the country, brother? Blooming, I trust, and green." That's it. That is the whole reference to the countryside in the whole play. If you know the poems of Dryden, the poems of Pope, I think you'll agree with me that there is very little intense feeling for nature. There is almost none of that in Dryden and very little of it in Pope. If you think about poems like, I'm trying to think some of you might have read in the survey course, something like Dryden's Macflecno, which obviously deals with the writing, the sort of condition of literature in the 17th century, that doesn't have much to do. In fact, it's all about London, isn't it? And where the Thames flows and all the rest. And how about The Rape of the Lock? Pope's probably best known work. It doesn't deal with the country at all, except, well, there's an occasional reference to the Thames flowing through the countryside between London and Hampton Court. That is to say, two sort of citified, cultivated places where all the real action takes place. Also, the literature of the neoclassical age puts a lot more emphasis on what might be considered discursive, intellectual, and philosophical matters than personal, emotional, private sorts of matters. If we're used to poetry today, and I fear we are, for better or worse, as sort of, I will look into my belly button and tell you what I found there, sort of emotional. I mean, there's a lot of that. I'm not just being silly. There, in 20th century poetry, for instance, we have a major development in modern American poetry in the 40s and 50s called the confessional school of poetry. And poets like, say, Robert Lowell in the 20th century or Sylvia Plath in the 20th century are obvious examples of that. And then, of course, unlike those two poets who are really quite distinguished, we have 8 million zillion undergraduates who, well, I'm afraid at a considerably lower level, are convinced that their latest emotional crisis is sort of literature without doing much to it. You know, all you have to do is just write it down with a lot of exclamation points and so forth, and you've got instant literature. And, well, as the kids say on the playground, or used to 2 or 3 years ago, not. You know, it tells you sort of where, you can often tell what the condition of literature is in a particular age by looking at the bad as well as at the good. And we have a lot of, I'm afraid, awfully wretched stuff, you know, about my latest emotional crisis or whatever it may be. You would not have found that in the neoclassical age at all. The poets of that age viewed the public world, the philosophical world, the world of ideas, as where a poet ought to be. So, for instance, as some of you will know, what does Pope do when he is a very brilliant and young poet? He devotes himself to the writing of a work which he calls an essay on criticism. If you know the essay on criticism, you will know it is not an essay in our sense at all. It's a poem about the elements of criticism. It begins, "'Tis hard to say if greater want of skill appear in writing or in judging ill, but of the two less grievous the offense to tire our patience than mislead our sin." You see, it's an essay in what? In verse, isn't it? And when he gets to be a more mature poet, he writes an essay on an even bigger philosophical issue, not literary criticism this time, but what he calls his essay on man. And that, too, is, by which he means mankind. He's not being sexist, I promise. What does he say there? He says, "The proper study of mankind is man," is one of the lines in it. "Placed on the isthmus of a middle state, a being darkly wise and rudely great," he says. Talking about the mixed nature of humanity and so forth. It's brilliantly written. It's wonderful poetry, it really is. But it is poetry of ideas, poetry of discourse. The same is true of Dryden to a very large degree. Dryden begins one of his finest poems this way. "Well then, the promised hour has come at last. The present age of wit obscures the last. Our sires were strong, and as they fought, they writ, winning by force of arms and dint of wit." He writes a poem in which he basically talks about the shift from what we would call the Renaissance to the neoclassical age. See, they were strong, but they didn't have the elegance we do, and that's really what he's talking about in that open, and what he goes on to talk about. In other words, it's poetry that deals with ideas, with concepts, rather than with personal feeling. There's not much personal feeling in Dryden, but there's a lot of fun in Dryden. When Dryden begins one of his poems like this, he says, this is Absalom Kitterfell, probably his most important poem, where he says, "In pious times ere priestcraft it began, before polygamy was made a sin, when man on many multiplied his kind." And what he's doing is kind of creating a never-never land of sexual promiscuity in which a king like King David, whom he's writing about in the Bible, later around it, is okay, and a king like Charles II, who was also pretty promiscuous, and that's who he's really writing about, can also be okay. But it's funny, it's historical, it's intellectual. You are not going to find Dryden telling you about Dryden's latest emotional crisis or what it felt like when he fell in love. If he ever fell in love, he didn't write about it. Pope didn't much either. Pope's much more likely to talk about, to create a poem in which it sounds like conversation. For instance, at one point in one of his most brilliant poems, this is his epistle to Arthur, he's talking about being tired. He's talking about how he's gotten to be a famous man and everybody wants to come and see him, and he doesn't want to see anybody anymore. So what does he say at the beginning of his poem? Listen to John Arthur. He says, shut the door, good John. Fatigued, I said. Tie up the knocker. Say I'm sick. I'm dead. The dogs, and you see what I mean? Tell them, go away. I don't want to see anybody. Tell them I'm sick. Tell them I'm dead. Tie up the knocker. What does he mean by that? Put a sort of bandana or anything around the knocker so that it won't knock, you see, so that it's muted. Tie up the knocker. Say I'm sick. I'm dead. The dog star rages. Nay, 'tis past all doubt. All bedlam, or Parnassus, is let out, he said. In other words, the dog says it's hot. And of course, what's supposed to happen when the dogs start raging? That's the hot constellation. It involves Sirius. It's like in July, things have gotten too hot, people have gone nuts, and what are they all doing? All Bedlam, which is where they kept the lunatics, or Parnassus, which is where the poets are supposed to live, is let out. Fire in each eye and papers in each hand, they rave, recite, and madden round the land. You know, it suddenly creates this hilarious satiric vision of a world inhabited by mad poets going from door to door. Read this, look at this. And he's saying, shut the door. I don't want to deal with these people. Leave me alone. It's a scream. It's not exactly, though, what we expect of poetry these days. It's because, well, the main reason it's not what we expect is that we are great-great-grandchildren of, guess what? Romanticism. Now, when Romanticism began to develop, what form did it take? Well, I think it's fair to say in certain ways, and we can look at some of the works that you read last night, it is looking for some alternative to the neoclassical world. The neoclassical world was civilized and elegant and polished, but maybe it was a little bit too civilized for some people. That is to say, wouldn't it be nice if we could at least occasionally get a glimpse of something wild and primitive and strange instead of things that are civilized, elegant, and rationally understandable? And that was one of the impulses, I think, that led, in other words, a kind of longing for, or a hunger for, the primitive, the heroic, the wild, the romantic. This is really what the word romantic originally meant. It simply meant something that was beyond ordinary, rational sort of consideration. You could have a romantic landscape, that is one that was too wild, in other words, not like a garden, but like a kind of wild, great mountains and soaring cliffs. That could be a romantic landscape, and that's the way the word was originally used. Or you could have a romantic feeling, but what that meant was it was originally not a positive thing at all. It meant a feeling that was not properly governed by reason, by intelligence, by decorum, and so forth. And you'll find in many 18th century novels someone saying, oh, don't be romantic. Meaning, of course, don't be extravagant, don't be foolish, don't be silly. And that's really what the word in the 18th century mainly meant. If you've read Jane Austen, who lived in the Romantic period, but was not a romantic at all. In fact, she wasn't. However much the movie makers try to make her out to be, she simply wasn't. She was a classic neoclassical sort of writer. And if you have really read one of her novels, you will know how true that is. For instance, what's the beginning of Pride and Prejudice? Does anyone know the famous sentence? It is a truth universally acknowledged that a young man in possession of a great fortune must be in want of a what? What? Now there is a romantic view of marriage, isn't it? No. It is an ironic, humorous, comic view based on the idea that most marriages are marriages of what? Material convenience. For better or worse, they are. Now, of course, there are ways of escaping that, and Elizabeth Bennet, to some degree, does escape that. But she is the one who does. Others, not so much. Charlotte Lucas, in that novel, settles and explains why she settled. And boy, when you settle for that miserable clergyman college that she married, you've settled, haven't you? Nothing romantic about that. Or if you've read something like, Northanger Abbey, her parody of the Gothic novel. She makes fun of the romantic Gothic novel, and her heroine there, was her name, Catherine Morland, I believe. She says at the beginning, there was nothing apparent in the appearance, or the mind, or the behavior of Catherine Morland that would have qualified her for a romantic heroine. And in fact, there isn't. She's a drab, tall, prosaic little girl who has convinced herself that she is a romantic heroine. And in fact, the whole novel is a kind of satire on romantic self-delusion. If you've read or even seen the movie Sense and Sensibility, there you have it, don't you? Sensibility is the sort of romantic tendency, but it doesn't go too far. Sensibility is okay. It's not bad. A little silly sometimes, but it's okay. But you'll notice the girl in the novel, the sister in the novel who represents sensibility, does not in fact end up marrying the handsome, dashing young man she thinks she is romantically attracted to, but she marries a stable, decent, honest, older man who in fact is not terribly romantic, but is very decent and good at all. And of course, the other sister never for one moment thinks about the things in those romantic terms. So during the later 18th century, what you get is neoclassicism holding on to a very great degree to general culture and general literature. The fact that Samuel Johnson, some of you will read Samuel Johnson, who is very neoclassical, very much of the neoclassical age, dominates. In fact, he was called by many writers at the time the great Cham of literature, which means like the great, what would you say, the great poobah of literature, you know, the great emperor of grand wizard, I don't know, of literature. And the fact that he dominated the last half of the 18th century tells you that neoclassicism did not go away. The fact that Jane Austen is still alive and well and brilliant and productive in the early 19th century, at the same time that Wordsworth and Coleridge and Byron are writing their poems, tells you that neoclassicism did not go away even after Romanticism had pretty much won the day. But there were strong impulses. One of them is, as I say, this search for the primitive, the wild, the heroic, that of course the neoclassical civilized age did not really satisfy. Was there anything you read last night that very clearly reflects that love of the wild and the primitive, or the longing for it? Does anyone know anything about Thomas Gray at all? Ever heard of Thomas Gray? He has the distinction of having probably written the single most popular one poem in the English language. I say that because it has been more often reprinted, more often translated, more often read, and more often anthologized than any other poem in the English language. It's not one of the ones that you read, but he did. What's his most famous work? No, that's Harry. You're thinking of Harry. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is now fly. That's the 17th century. But Gray wrote one. Here's how it begins. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The lowing herd winds slow o'er the lea. The plowman homeward plods his weary way and leaves the world to darkness and it has a few famous lines in it, like, far from the madding crowd's ennobled strife, the paths of glory lead but to the grave. Such things as that. It really is a tremendously important one. It's called The Elegy in a Country Churchyard by Thomas Gray. Yay, we do know that. That's good, but it is a very important poem. Now, if we look a little bit more into Thomas Gray, what do we find? This was a man who was in many ways straight 18th century. He really was. He had a formidable classical education. He was probably the best educated man of his time. Either he or Samuel Johnson, he was sort of tossed a coin between. He had read everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. He read Latin and wrote it with just as easily as he wrote English. Greek, same thing. French, Italian, German, Scandinavian tongues, including Old Icelandic. He was a scholar of profound learning. He also was probably one of the most learned naturalists of the time. He knew all about botany and flowers and such things. He was just a tremendously learned man, very much an intellectual, fairly typical of the 18th century. He was a scholar who was officially a scholar. That is, he was a professor, what we would call a professor, what they would call a fellow, at Cambridge University, and lived most of his life in the cloistered halls of that great university. He was a civilized, urbane man of the world and of culture. You read his letters and you think, the 18th century, with all of its civilization, all of its urbanity, with all of its intelligence, its learning, that's the 18th century. But then you pick up this volume, and here is Thomas Gray, and the first poem you've got is The Fatal Sisters. What the devil is The Fatal Sisters about? Well, you notice, from the Norse tongue. Now, it's not literally a translation. What he's done is he's taken elements of Nordic or Old Germanic mythology, and he has written a new poem roughly in the style of Nordic poems. Now, these are very primitive sorts of poems, aren't they? It's really close to things like, well, what is our version in English of Nordic or Old Germanic literature? I mean, of the Dark Ages, of the early Middle Ages. We have versions of that in English, don't we? You read one, I'll bet you. Beowulf is an example. The Wanderer, the Seafarer, the Dream of the Root, things like that. But the poems he's looking at here are even older than that. They are really from the Dark Ages, and they go back to mythic, legendary, Old Germanic, Old Norse sort of legends. Anyone guess who the Fatal Sisters are here, basically? Let me give you a hint. An auditory hint. The Valkyrie, that's who they are. The Fatal Sisters here. Those maidens in Germanic legend who, of course, preside over battle and go out and swoop up the heroes who die upon the battlefield and who determine the destinies of battle. And, of course, in Wagner's Germanic, legendary, mythic opera, that music is to indicate the ride of the Valkyrie as they go to gather up the dead heroes who died to take them off to Valhalla, right? The sort of Nordic, Germanic heaven for what is known as heroes who die in battle. This is not the neoclassical 18th century, is it? This is not a drawing room. This is not Mozart. This is not elegant, civilized life. In fact, what are these Fatal Sisters like? Here, they're like, do they remind you of anything else other than the Valkyrie? Let me read a little bit of it on page 9. Now the storm begins to lower, haste the loom of hell prepare, iron sheet of airy shower, hurdles in the darkened air. Does this sound like? Amen. Yes! Bubble, bubble, toil and trouble. And of course there we have what? The Gothic, the supernatural, the strange, the bizarre, and also the violent, right? Glittering lances are the loom, where the dusky warp we strain, weaving many a soldier's doom. Orkney's woe and Ranver's bane. Orkney and Ranver, obviously soldiers, warriors who are going to die in battle. Now they are weaving the sort of texture of destiny here. And what do they weave it out of? God, I don't know what people thought of this when it came out in the 18th century. But of course what Gray would say is, I don't mean it to be taken all that seriously. I'm simply recreating as a kind of antiquarian game the violent, heroic legends of the mythic early medieval past. Of course, I, as a civilized man, don't have any great interest in such things. What does that allow him to do? Have fun. That is to sort of dive off into the wild, violent, heroic past and escape the elegant, civilized polish of his own age. I mean, listen to this not only in terms of what it says, but how it says it, the rhythm, the movement. And notice how far we are from, let me think if I can, thin glittering textures of the film view dipped in the richest tinge of the sky. That's Pope's account of the silks, in the Rape of the Lock. Or, what is it now? The great account of Belinda, if you remember, putting on her makeup when she trembling begins the sacred rites of pride. As she puts on her makeup and hear what the elephant and tortoise unite, transformed to coals, the speckle and the white. What happens to elephants and tortoises? They're made into ivory combs and tortoiseshell combs so that a beautiful girl can put them on. That's the world of the 18th century. Nice china, nice silver, beautiful architecture, Mozart in the background, and everything is beautiful in the garden. What is Gray, meanwhile, doing, sitting at Cambridge there? What kind of dreams has he got? See the grisly texture grow, 'tis of human entrails made. Human entrails? This is not elegant at all, is it? This is horrifying. And the weights that play below, each a gasping warrior's head. And it goes on in that sort of theatrically bloody, violent, heroic, primitive sort of way, doesn't it? Let's skip down and say, let's go. Shafts for shuttles dipped in gore. What's gore? Blood, you see. Shoot the trembling cords along. Sword that once a monarch bore. Keep the tissues close and strong. Mista black, terrific maid. And he means literally terrific. That is, terrifying. Sangreda. What was sangreda? Blood. Like sangria, the drink in Spanish. There you get to say. And Hilda C. joined the wayward work to aid. 'Tis the woof of victory. That is, they're weaving the texture of the future. They also, in this sense, it reminds one a little bit, doesn't it, of the destinies in classical mythology, who weave the destinies of the future. It's very much that sort of thing. What we're going to have here, in other words, is war, blood, heroes, Valkyrie, bloodshed, and why would all that appeal to an over-refined, elegant professor of modern letters and history at Cambridge in the urbane 18th century? Well, that's exactly why it would, you see, as it did to... Now, is this the only example we have of that sort of thing? Did you read anything else, for instance, that maybe suggested a love of the primitive, the heroic, or the wild? Look at the brief selection from James McPherson over on page 51. This is from a collection of poems that McPherson published in the 1760s and 1770s called the Poems of Ossian. Now, James McPherson is an interesting figure. He was a Scot, and he tried to pull a little hoax. That's what he did. He said, I have found the manuscripts of ancient Scottish, Bardic, Celtic poetry. And they deal, of course, with all kinds of what? Heroic figures, dark landscapes, romantic violence and passion. In other words, everything that the 18th century wasn't. And he claimed that he had found these in various monasteries and so forth, and that he was going to edit them and translate them and then produce them for the public, which he did, as the Poems of Ossian. And all kinds of people loved them. Thomas Gray, for instance, loved them. Very, very interesting. Napoleon, later on, thought they were magnificent, thought they were greater than Homer, he said, and all the rest. There was only one problem. They were phony. McPherson didn't have maybe a few fragments, but not much, of Celtic or Gaelic. These are the old ancient languages of Scotland and Ireland. Didn't have them. He simply made up his idea of what a Celtic or Gaelic bard, notice bard. Would Pope or Dryden have called themselves bards? No. They would have called themselves wits. Men of the world who have a facility for writing verse. That's not at all what a bard is. What is a bard? William Blake will later say, hear the voice of the bard, who present, past, and future sees, whose ears have heard the holy word that walked among the ancient trees. What's a bard? It's about half poet and half sorcerer, isn't it? A kind of almost Merlin figure. A figure who has magical powers of expression. It's what Coleridge is talking about, isn't it? When he talks about in Kubla, weave a circle round him thrice, for he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. His idea of the poet is that he is divinely inspired and has supernatural powers of expression and creation, which are godlike. That's not what the 18th century thought. What did the 18th century think poetry was mostly? True wit is nature to advantage dressed, says poet. What oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. In other words, it's the ability to express things with elegant, precise, brilliant clarity and precision. That's what being a good poet is. That's what Dryden thought. That's what Pope thought. That's what Samuel Johnson thought. The best words in the best places. That will do it. That is not what the ancient idea of the poet was. The ancient idea was that you were a kind of bard, a minstrel, a kind of... Does anyone know the Anglo-Saxon word? where they were basically the historians, the magicians, the medicine man, and the storytellers in verse of their tribes. They called them in Anglo-Saxon shows, S-C-O-P-S. It was a show who wrote Beowulf, right, or who composed Beowulf. And what is our elegant 18th century poet trying to do here? Recreate something of that ancient bardic tradition. And how does he treat, well, for one thing, look at the description of things on page 51. Night is dull and dark. The clouds rest on the hills. No star with twinkling beam, no moon looks from the skies. I hear the blast in the wood, but distant and dull I hear it. The stream of the valley murmurs, low is its murmur too. From the tree at the grave of the dead, the lonely screech owl groans. I see a dim form on the plain. 'Tis a ghost. It fades. It flies. It ain't Pope, is it? Or Dryden, or Samuel Johnson. It's all about what? Fearful landscapes, fearful thoughts, ghosts, goblins, things that go bumping on, terror and all the rest of it. The 18th century was so civilized that every now and then it wanted to scare itself again. Does this help to explain why the Gothic novel first develops in the 18th century? I'm tired of reason. I'm tired of common sense. Let me imagine a ghostly picture that gleams, a ghostly figure who clanks its chains as it goes through the Gothic towers of an abandoned castle, and so forth and so on. By the way, we call these Gothic novels, and in a way, these poems we've been looking at are sort of Gothic poems in two senses. Not only Gothic because they deal with the sort of Dark Ages, but also Gothic because they represent a kind of fearful Middle Ages. Let me give you an example. In one of the greatest plays of the neoclassical age, William Congreve, brilliant playwright, has a young lady, Millicent is her name, who is being, what can I say, importuned. She's being sort of courted by a country bumpkin. And this country bumpkin keeps making advances, which she doesn't want to have anything to do with. And at one point, when he makes one advance too many, she turns away from him, sticks out her hand like that, pushes him away, and says, "Oh, ruder than Gothic." She is speaking using the word Gothic in the true 18th century sense. That is, what did they think of Gothic? It was rude, primitive, uncivilized, inelegant, unpolished, and just downright stupid. It belonged to the Dark Ages, after all. Now, what we have here in the works we've just been looking at is a kind of reaction against that. There's a kind of, maybe it's interesting to go back to the Gothic Middle Ages. Maybe there's something there in that primitivism that's fascinating. Would it surprise you to learn that Horace Walpole, remember Horace Walpole, the fellow who said life is a tragedy for those who feel, comedy for those who think? In addition to being an 18th century man, was also, not just the father of the Gothic novel, but he was so fascinated by Gothic things that he built himself a little house down south of London. Notice, not far from London, though, so he could go there when he wanted to. And he called his little house Strawberry Hill. And guess what he built? A tiny little pseudo-Gothic palace for himself. And might be interesting for you to see this. We sometimes get the idea, I think, that the literature we're reading all, took the form of the Norton Anthology immediately, and it's a conspiracy of English professors, or it became, it was the Penguin paperback edition, And of course, that's not true. The literature we're reading was real. It was printed in real time, read by real people, and so forth. And so whenever I can, I like to show the real stuff. This is the 1757 edition, first edition of Mr. Gray's Odes. We're not reading either of these odes, but this is typical of his poetry and came out at the same time as what we're reading. And you'll see here, printed at Strawberry Hill, which was Horace Walpole's place. He had a private printing press for the printing of sort of interesting new literature that was coming out. And not everybody can see this, but those in front can. There's a little engraving there that shows Strawberry Hill, and notice it's a little Gothic castle where this was printed the first time. Surrounded, you notice, by sort of little landscape and all the rest. The whole thing really presenting, although it's printed in 1757, a kind of romantic appearance. And there's what these poems look like when they were first printed. There's the beginning. Typical of the poems as they came out in the middle of the 18th century, 1757, which is when Gray is mostly active. And so there you have it, that sort of longing for something primitive, something heroic, something wild. That's one of the things that leads to the rediscovery of a kind of romanticism and the sort of reestablishment, if you want, of a kind of romanticism. Secondly, the neoclassical age had put so much emphasis on a poetry of statement, that is, poetry. Dryden begins McFlecknoe, doesn't he? All human things are subject to decay, and when fate summons, monarchs must obey. It has great strength and power, brilliant opening. But does it tell us one thing? Would it ever occur to anybody to set that to music? I don't believe it ever has been done, and I can't imagine. Why do we set anything to music? Now, one of the poets, well, let me, I will answer the question sort of, but give you some hints anyway. Robert Burns will be one of the last pre-romantic poets we will look at. And what is he famous for, mainly? His songs. He wrote verses, and he had in mind traditional Scottish melodies to which they could be sung. We'll read, for instance, one that is called, as some of you will know, Flow Gently, Ye Flowery Banks of Bonny Dew. Well, I didn't ask you to read it last time, but we'll get there. It's a song. It's a lyric. Do Pope and Dryden mostly write lyrics? Can you imagine saying, shut the door, good John, fatigued I said, tie up the knocker, say I'm sick, I'm dead, the dog's not raging. No, it's not going to happen. Why? Because the poetry is mainly talk, it's versified. It exists on the level of statement. When you write a lyric and when you want to sing, why do you want to sing? Remember what the spiritual says? I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm... It's the expression of emotion, isn't it? And so there is not much, as you could almost expect, there's not much lyric writing in the neoclassical age. But when Romanticism begins to evolve toward what we know as Romanticism, it inevitably starts singing. And why is that? Because emotion. Why does tragedy feel? Emotion becomes much more important. So when you read, Ye flowery banks of bonny Doon, how can ye bloom so fair? Because he wrote it in Scots, in border Scots. He doesn't want you to read it. He doesn't want you to, Ye flowery banks of bonny Doon, how can ye bloom so fair? He wants you to have in the background there somewhere, if you'll forgive me, Ye flowery banks of bonny Doon, how can ye bloom softer, softer? How can ye chant, ye little birds, and I suppose a care, oh care, thou'll break my heart, thou break my heart, thou bonny Virginia, I who am so full of care. This is a long way from shut the door, good John, fatigued I said, tie up the knocker, say I'm sick, I'm dead. The movement toward lyrical expression, which means song-like expression. When you see a word like ode, the word ode means basically a complex and elaborate lyric. Now, obviously, odes are not songs, are they? I mean, that Robert Burns is a particularly good example because it's a straightforward lyric in the absolute sense. But odes are also lyrical. In other words, they clearly, you have to have some sense of music behind them, some sense of emotion behind them. For instance, to return to Thomas Gray just for a second, when he is contemplating, look on page 11, the relationship between natural changes in the landscape and the more complex changes within human feeling and human experience, he naturally writes an ode on the pleasure arising from vicissitude. Vicissitude means what we would call the ups and downs of emotional life. Now look at the second stanza. Newborn flocks in rustic dance, frisking ply their feeble feet, forgetful of their wintry trance, the birds his presence greet. Now he turns to the bird, and look what he says about the bird. But chief, the skylark warbles high, his trembling, thrilling ecstasy, and lessening from the dazzled sight, melts into air and liquid light. He doesn't say, look at the bird. It's an interesting bird. It goes south in the winter. And he's not interested. He's interested in a kind of over-the-top emotional reaction to the bird, isn't he? Are we going to have a lot of that in the Romantic age? In fact, there a skylark is addressed and described. But chief the skylark warbles high, his trembling, thrilling ecstasy. Not too much ecstasy. You see. But here is the beginning of that sort of thing. Who will more famously address a skylark? Hail to thee, blithe spirit, bird thou never wert, that from heaven or near it thou pourest forth thy heart in unpremeditated strains of art. Shelley will write to a skylark woman, and Keats will write to a nightingale, and Coleridge will write a poem called The Nightingale. And Wordsworth will write to a skylark too. It's not as famous, but it's a very fine poem. And in fact, how many romantic poets will address boys in one way or the other? Why would they like birds? They're free. They fly up to heights, don't they? And what else do? They sing. It's perfect, isn't it? You're going to have a lot of bird poetry in the Romantic age. It fits. So the love of lyric expression. Look at another one. Chatterton on page 53, his poem on page 53. Actually, I'm not going to use one on 53. I'll use one on 55. The minstrels. Notice the minstrels what? Song. Song. Lyric, right? It's meant to express emotion, intensity of feeling. It is song-like. It is not a poetry of statement, but a poetry of feeling and expression and lyricism. Now, does anyone know anything about Thomas Chatterton? Very interesting figure. I said last time at the end of the last period that he became sort of the poster boy of the whole Romantic age. And he really did. Coleridge wrote a sonnet about him. Keats dedicated his long poem Endymion to his memory. Wordsworth refers to him in a poem we will look at in Resolution and Independence as I thought of Chatterton, the marvelous, wondrous boy, the sleepless soul that perished in his pride. Well, I'm afraid he did perish in his pride. He was 17 years old when he committed suicide. Now, why did he commit suicide? Well, I think in part because he was probably born in the wrong age. As a very small boy, he grew up in the southwestern town in England of Bristol. It's a seacoast town. And there's a beautiful Gothic church in Bristol called Mary St. Redcliffe's. And apparently from his earliest childhood, he loved that Gothic church. It reminded him of the sort of romantic possibilities of the bygone Middle Ages and the Dark Ages. And he, as a child, there are descriptions of him sort of wandering around and sitting in it, looking at through the stained glass windows and contemplating the flying buttresses and all the different features of the Gothic building. And eventually, when he got a little bit older, about 10 or so, he wandered around down in the basement of the church. And what did he find there but some old books, actually from the Renaissance, but he took them to be from the Middle Ages, that were in black letter, that looked like the Middle Ages. And he learned to read sort of early English style written in Gothic letters, which he took to be medieval. It really wasn't. He thought he was reading Middle English like Chaucer. No, he really wasn't. It was a little bit later than that. But it inspired him to a very great degree. And this really sort of boy wonder began to get the idea, what if there had been a medieval poet here in Bristol? Let's call him Thomas Rowley. Yeah. And then what if he wrote interesting poems very different from what Pope, Dryden, and Johnson are writing now, that are medieval, romantic, lyrical, in a kind of Middle English. But of course he didn't properly understand Middle English. Very few people, you know what I mean by Middle English. Let me do a little bit of it here. Yes, what does Chaucer say about the little birds? That's why birds. The little birds. He says, the small fool that mock a melody, that slave in all the need, with all the need. That is the small birds that do what? The small fools that mock a melody, that make melodies, sing, and slave in all the need, with open need. He says they sleep all night with open eye, which I believe is a fairly wonky bit of natural history. I don't believe they do. But nevertheless, it's a beautiful line, isn't it? That slave in all the need, with open eye. That's Middle English. That's real Middle English. It's of the Middle Ages. Chatterton was drawn to that because it was such an alternative, but he didn't really properly understand it. Happily for him, not many other people did in the 18th century either. They were interested in classical Greek, classical Latin, that they knew. Modern languages like Italian and Spanish, they often knew. But medieval languages like Middle English, Old Icelandic, things like that, knew. Anglo-Saxon, they didn't understand those, didn't know much about it. So he got away. What he did, and he really did do this, he claimed that he had found, does this begin to sound familiar? What did McPherson do? McPherson said, I have found a Gaelic poet named Ossian, and here's his work. He didn't. He didn't. It was phony. But you can see why he didn't want to. It gave him an excuse to write in a totally different way from what was typical of the neoclassical age. What does Thomas Chatterton do? Exactly the same thing. He creates a medieval poet, whom he calls Thomas Rowley, and then he writes things in a kind of pseudo-Middle English. Have you ever seen those signs in sort of quaint little towns that will say things like, ye olde shoppy, you know? And of course that's not the way, you know what I mean. You know, that sort of thing, so as to make it look old. Well, that was sort of Thomas Chatterton's approach to Middle English. He really didn't understand Middle English, nobody much did, but he wrote in a kind of semi-pseudo, halfway, antique, quasi-Middle English. In fact, many years later, Charles Lamb, brilliant romantic essayist who wrote brilliantly, but also who, as he himself said, stuttered abominably, was looking at some of Thomas Chatterton's poems. And they were commenting on how he had made everything look old by adding ease to everything. And Charles Lamb came up and said, it must have been written by that mob of gentlemen that wrote with ease. And of course, what the mob of gentlemen who wrote with ease is a Pope line about the elegant poets like Herrick, who wrote easily, you see. It didn't have anything to do with wrote with ease, but it was a kind of pun, see, kind of joke. I love explaining my jokes, but anyway, that's what he was saying. Well, that is sort of the way Thomas Chatterton wrote. But the funny thing is that underneath the sort of phony, blony, medieval Gothicism of this, he actually was a kind of genius. And you can tell that if you look at the minstrel song. Notice, just like McPherson wrote what? The songs of bards, what we've got here are minstrel songs. Now, what is a minstrel? No, that's the American sort of way down on the Swanee River. No, that's not. No, a minstrel is a medieval poet who basically is, again, a kind of poet of the people, a kind of, but he's a singing poet, isn't he? The minstrel, who's the minstrel figure in Robin Hood legends? Is it Alan the Dale? I can't remember, but anyway. And there are minstrels, of course, minstrel figures in Arthurian romance and all the rest of the Middle Ages. A sort of poet who is a singer, a kind of early poet. And what does he write here? Oh, singing to me rondelay. Oh, drop the briny tear with me. Dance no more at holiday. Like a running river be. My love is dead, gone to his deathbed, all under the willow tree. Black his hair as the winter night, white his robe, which means his complexion. As the sea threw in a few old words that had been forgotten, hoping that would make it sort of seem antique. But imagine, this was written when he was 15 years of age. Now listen to the melody of the words. Oh, sing unto me roundelay, oh, drop the briny tear with me. Dance no more at holiday, like a running river be. My love is dead, gone to his deathbed, all under the willow tree. Black his hair as the winter night, white his robe as the summer snow, red his face as the morning light, cold he lies in the grave below. My love is dead, gone to his deathbed, all under the willow tree. Sweet his tongue as the throstle's note, ah, the throstle's note, another boy. The boys are gathering, aren't they? They're sort of empire, I'm being sort of silly, but the birds, the song of the bird becomes much more important here than it was in most neoclassical poetry. Quick and dance his thought can be, deft his tabor, cudgel stout. Oh, he lies by the willow tree. My love is dead, gone to his deathbed, all under the willow tree. It's actually a very beautiful, haunting sort of lyric of the sort that I guarantee you Poe, I love Poe, very great poet, but he never wrote anything that sounds like that in his life, neither did he never would have thought about it. But Chatterton has the true sort of song impulse, the true lyric impulse. In fact, does it remind you, it's not really medieval sounding at all. Would anyone care to guess what it does sound like? What does it sound like to you? Ever read Othello? What does Desdemona sing right before she's murdered? She sings, "A poor maid sat sighing by a sycamore tree. A willow, 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 a willow, or garland of willow shall be thy garland," and so forth and so on. It's a sad song about death and romance and all the rest. The Willow Song, it's called. Or if you know what, Green Sleep, what does that come from? Alas, my love, you have cast me on the skies, and so forth. Where does that come from? It's from the Renaissance. If he doesn't sound like the Middle Ages, he sounds a whole lot like Shakespeare's song. And that's mainly the influence that produced something like this. But that he could write this when he was 15 really shows that not only he had real ability, but he also was looking for a new way of writing, a more lyrical way of writing, a way of writing. And how does he achieve that? By claiming that he, in fact, didn't write these things at all. That, in fact, they were written by a Gothic monk of the Middle Ages. I'm sorry to say that eventually his imposture was discovered, and he was so distraught, so unhappy when it was discovered that he, as I say, committed suicide at the sad age of 17. It's a great loss. I don't know how great a poet he would eventually have become, but there is no child prodigy, perhaps, in English poetry quite so haunting as Thomas Chatterton, and it's a shame that he died so young. If you look carefully at these poets that I asked you to look at last night, I don't know how many of you are interested in what might be called, sort of psychopathology. That is to say, the psychology of artists. Perhaps artists are always a little frail because they're a lot more sensitive than most of us. And so, there's sort of the, you know what I mean if I say the parrots in the cave of life? That is, when people used to go down and work in caves, they always used to take a little parakeet with them, a bird in a cage, because if the gas got bad enough, what would happen? The bird would die before the people did. I sometimes think that artists are sort of the parrots in the cave of life. That is to say, they know things are bad before most of us do. We're sort of schlepping along. The world's going to hell. But artists have a way of seeing that and feeling that and knowing that and expressing that, but they really feel it. And I think the evidence of that is these writers that I asked you to look at last time were beginning to sort of explore new territory. And really beginning to suggest that maybe the neoclassical vision of life was not a completely adequate vision of life. They paid for being ahead of their time. Thomas Chatterton paid by committing suicide at age 17. Christopher Smart, Well, Christopher Smart, what did he write? I will sing of my cat Geoffrey, for he is the servant of the Lord, duly and daily serving, and he can spraggle upon waggle, and though he cannot fly, he is an excellent clamourer. And so, have you ever seen a cat in such wild, mystical, strange, and bizarre ways? It's the greatest cat poem in the English language. It really is, the poem on Cat Geoffrey. And does it have anything to do with the neoclassical age? It does not. It is as strange, eccentric, bizarre, and wild as anything in the whole Romantic period. And you know how Christopher Smart ended his days? In a madhouse. He died in an insane asylum. William Collins, who wrote the Ode on Poetical Character and the Ode to Evening, that's beautiful. If all of Odin stop or Pascal Reed can hold chaste Eve to soothe thy listening ear, and all that. What happened to him at about age 30? He goes mad and ends his life in a lunatic asylum. Thomas Gray, though he was tremendously learned, was also tremendously neurotic. And, for instance, he was hired to be professor of modern history at Cambridge, and he was a very learned man, as I've already said, probably the most learned man of his time. But he was so neurotic, shy, and afraid to get up in public that, in fact, he was expected. It was really an ornamental sort of post. I mean, he was given it because he was such an important figure. But he was expected maybe once a year to actually deliver a lecture. He was at Cambridge for 30 years, and he never delivered the first lecture. He kept planning, but he never got around to doing it. I'm afraid modern university administrators would have said, I don't see why we need to keep anybody like that around. And got rid of it. Of course, he probably was a learning man in Cambridge at that time, but he didn't lecture publicly because he just couldn't bring himself to do it. William Cooper, it looks like Calvin, was afflicted with such a deep sense of personal grief and personal damnation. That is, he felt that he had been singled out for some special damnation by God. He didn't quite know why, but he felt it. A kind of really very depressive state of mind. He was intermittently insane throughout most of the second half of his life. When he was sane, he wrote some of the most beautifully sane poems in the English language. But if you remember the poem written in insanity, or better yet, maybe, the poem called The Castaway on page 48. Very interesting poem. He tells the story in The Castaway of a sailor who swept overboard, right? And it's a very moving account. The poor man who's left in the waves, and he knows he's going to die, and the ship goes on, and he hears the cries of the men fading off in the distance, and knows he's going to die, and it's moving on that basis. But what really makes it interesting is at the end of the poem, just when you think, well, this is a sort of narrative poem about a man who dies at sea, which, by the way, is based on a true Hansen, who was a real sailor, and he did indeed die at sea. But watch what Cooper does in the last two stanzas on page 50. I therefore purpose not or dream descanting on his fate to give the melancholy theme a more enduring date. So he says, I'm not intending to make this event immortal by writing this poem. I wouldn't claim that. So why am I writing this poem? But misery still delights to trace its semblance in another's case. No voice divine the storm allayed, no light propitious shone. When snatched from all effectual aid, we perished, each alone. But I beneath a rougher sea and whelmed in deeper gulfs than he. And that same note is to be found, for instance, in the poem on page 42, lines written during a period of insanity. And what does he feel about himself? Hatred and vengeance, my eternal portion scarce can endure delay of execution. Wait with impatient readiness to seize my soul in a moment. Damned below Judas, more abhorred than he was, who for a few pence sold his holy master, twice betrayed Jesus, me, the last delinquent, deems the profanest, man disavows, a deity disowns me, and so forth. This is a man, actually, is a man you can say two things about him. One is he is deeply troubled, and the second thing is he's brilliantly articulate. That is, he knows how to express it with great power and great force. But he nevertheless feels a tremendous sense of anxiety. Look at page, I'm about to shut up. On page 41, The Task, which is his most famous poem. This is only one brief section from it. I was a stricken deer that left the herd long since. Just a hauntingly beautiful beginning. In other words, what does he paint himself as being? The lonely, romantic, solitary, alienated figure who has lost contact with society. You may think you don't know William Cooper, but you do. Because among his other poems, and they came out of his feelings of insanity and damnation and so forth, he wrote, along with a man named John Newton, probably the most famous hymns in the English language. That is, they were written in the 1770s. They're called the Olney hymns by Cooper and Newton. And you know some of them. I guarantee you do. One of them by Cooper begins, there is a fountain filled with blood drawn from Emmanuel's veins. And that's Cooper. And of course, Newton, his collaborator in those hymns, called the Olney hymns, they're called that because they were written in the Northamptonshire town of Olney, is probably as famous a hymn as we have in English. What is it? Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Why would that appeal to Cooper? Because he feels himself to be virtually beyond the pale of hope. You might say, my God, what did he ever do? Nothing. But psychological states are not about reason, are they? That's the whole point. You're getting a picture, and you're right to get a picture, that even though every one of these writers you've been reading today was gifted, virtually all of them. Mark Aikenside's was pretty long. But otherwise, almost all of them suffered from some serious form of what we would call mental illness, at least to some. Why would that be so? I'm not going to answer that right now, but I'd like you to think about it. For next time, think about the context, think about what they're trying to do, and see if you don't come up with some answers there. Next time, we'll finish that first group of writers. I realize I haven't dealt with them in every case as carefully as I might, but I'll try to remedy that next time a little bit more. And also, if you would, no, we'll just stick with that, but do add Robert Burns, because I didn't give him last time, but I'd like you to add him. There's just about 3 pages that are Robert Burns, but I'd like to do him for next time. While I'm at it, though, here's the first edition of Cooper's The Task. So you say, again, see, this is the one from which I was the stricken deer that left the herd and so on. There it is. It came out in 1785. And there, you can see it's a great long poem. I mean, we read, a page of it. It's about 250 pages long. There's a great deal more of it than that. It's actually, there's the way it looks. So next time, on with the other pre-romantic poets, and then we'll strike on after that to William Blake. See you next time.